All right, guys. Sorry I couldn't be there today, so we're going to talk about the Crusades and the idea that Europeans are going to look outward in the 12th century and 11th century as they embark on a bunch of holy wars that will take them to the ancient Middle East, an area they would have called the Levant, as we'll talk about, or as we would say would be the Holy Land, mostly focused around here, the center, the great city for Muslims, Jews, and Christians, the city of Jerusalem. And as we'll see, there's going to be many different crusades. We're going to pretty much focus on the first four crusades and look at that. We're going to look at causes, how they were fought, and what happens during those crusades. So you can always go back to this map, and I'll have other maps for you to look at to see the routes taken by each major crusade and what happens on those crusades. So really, though, we're going to see the crusades have both positive and negative effects on Europe. Most notably positive, they're going to bring back learning and all the things we've lost that have been kept alive in the East in the Byzantine Empire and by the Muslims. And then also, too, we're going to see this negative aspects, the animosity between Christians and Muslims, even felt today. And also, too, we'll see that the ideas of the Crusades, even today, still can be pretty negative in the fact that you have a lot of murder and death caused in a religious setting for the Christian Catholic Church. So overall, the Crusades, when I say crusade, I simply mean a kind of holy war fought by Christian knights starting around the 11th century and going on for basically about 300 years. So to kind of backtrack a little bit, by 632, we know that the Prophet Muhammad had died, and after that, Islam keeps expanding both through warfare, but actually, as we've talked about, it's embraced a lot by the lower classes of the different people that the Muslim armies conquer, mostly because of the teachings of social justice. And also, contrary to popular belief in Islam, when they conquered you, you could pay a tax and continue your religion as long as you could pay the money. And most of the lower class people converted anyways. So, as we've seen with the Battle of Tor and whatnot in the 8th century, Islam really expands quickly after the death of Muhammad. The issue really becomes, though, around the 11th century when in 1071 a group of newly converted Muslims called the Seljuk Turks start to take over parts of what was the Byzantine Empire. So think of they kind of roll up from the Arabian Peninsula, and they roll from the south up to the north, and they take over places that we call modern day Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and they kind of push the borders of the Byzantine Empire up into basically the west coast of Turkey. So the Byzantine Empire by 1071 has lost quite a bit of land. And again, when the Crusaders and people would have called this area at the time, they would have called it the Levant. So if you hear the word Levant, even in some things that I posted for you to read, you would think that's kind of the Western term they would mean for basically the entire Middle East. And it's important for everybody at the time in this area because it is the Holy Land, because of the city of Jerusalem being so important to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Obviously, Christians and Jews, the temple is there for the Jews. Jesus is crucified and rises from the dead. But the Muslims also believe that Muhammad ascends into heaven from a place in Jerusalem we call the Dome of the Rock, where they build a mosque over this rock where they felt that Muhammad, after he passes away, his soul ascends into heaven from the city of Jerusalem. And what happens is as these Muslims take over, in the West, you're going to get a lot of propaganda. Probably not even that true. I mean, there probably were cases of this, but in the West, these stories are going to reach via these newly opening trade routes, saying that Christian pilgrims who have been traveling to the city of Jerusalem are going to be killed by Muslims after they took over the city, or they're going to be tortured. Now, again, this is probably propaganda. There's not a lot of historical truth to that, but there's enough of these stories that people in the West are going to start getting really riled up over what they see as is the mistreatment of the holy sites that are in Jerusalem and the mistreatment of pilgrims going to these holy sites. Most notably, there's a church called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that's built over the place where Jesus was allegedly crucified. and there was a lot of stories going on that the Muslims are mistreating this church. And to be fair, once the Crusades kind of start, the Muslims do actually knock down this Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But you're going to see there's a lot of propaganda that's going to go back and forth here between the East and the West. You got to think of it too. It's like a giant game of telephone because this information is taking so long to move via these trade routes. So you're going to have a Christian population in the West who hear these stories about these Muslims. They really know nothing about mistreating Christians. And it's going to kind of be the kindling that's going to light into this big fire that's going to be the Crusades. Things really start to escalate when in 1095 the Byzantine emperor, whose name is Alexius I, is going to be so desperate to kind of stop this Muslim march towards Constantinople that he's going to actually try to bury the hatchet on the Western Schism, in 1076 by basically sending a letter to the Pope, Pope Urban II, and literally asking him, hey, I know things have been bad between the two of us, but why don't you send me some crusaders who are going to be able to maybe help me get rid of these Muslims? Because let's face it, we might not agree on a lot of things religiously, but we believe in Jesus and we believe in Jerusalem should be in the hands of Christians. Again, the big schism in 1054 is going to kind of be looked over by Alexius when he's going to actually come kind of with his hat in his hand, send a letter to the Pope, say, please send me some troops. And the Pope, Urban II, as we're going to see, who's really feeling his oats in the West at this point with papal supremacy, as we learned about in section 3 of chapter 7, is going to be all too willing to hopefully get all of these knights to leave the West and go and kill a bunch of Muslims and take back the Holy Land. So in 1095, Pope Urban is going to call a council in the French city of Clermont. Now remember, the Pope can be infallible in two situations. One, when he sits on the throne of St. Peter's and he makes a decree, or two, when he calls a church council. He brings all the cardinals, bishops, archbishops together, and they make church dogma, church doctrine. In 1095, he's going to call a church council. They're going to meet, and the one issue that they're going to discuss in this church council is should they embark on a holy war to take back the holy city of Jerusalem. And at this council, the Council of Clermont, the Pope is going to come out into a giant field. So many people showed up to hear what he had to say. It wasn't even inside. He goes into a giant field, and he says that the church has decreed that we must go on a crusade to take back the Holy Land. And he literally says in Latin, Deus vult, God wills it. He basically says every knight in Europe who can must take their weapons and travel to the Holy Land and kill the Muslims and take back Jerusalem. And he says that if you do this, and this is again infallible, teaching of God, if you do this, every sin you have committed in your life will be forgiven. And number two, if you die on a crusade, you will automatically go straight to heaven. And remember, when a pope says this and a church council says this, this is a teaching of the church. So he's literally telling all these knights in Europe, in particular knights who probably didn't have any land, maybe the third or fourth born, who really are having a tough time getting a fief, go to the Holy Land, kill some Muslims, take their land. Number one, you're going to have all your sins forgiven. And number two, you're going to go straight to heaven if you die on this crusade. And since every knight in Europe believes implicitly that there is a heaven and they will go there if they have no sins that they've committed, then they're all going to believe it. So it's really going to set off a fever across Europe where people are going to really want to go to the East, places they've never been. Travel's beginning again. The world's getting a little bigger. It's going to really set off this idea that we need to go to the East and win back the Holy Land from these people called the Muslims. And it's going to really set Europe ablaze with this spirit of crusading. And again, this fever is gonna reach all across Europe. It's gonna be all over the place. Knights are gonna embark from all the major European areas. It's even so crazy that there's gonna be a bunch of peasants who literally go all the way to the Holy Land with nothing but like their pitchforks and their farm tools just to be slaughtered by the Muslims. It's a really sad situation. You can imagine, too, poor Alexius. He looks up from the walls of Constantinople one day and sees a bunch of peasants who have literally walked across Europe to get to the Holy Land. And let's just say the Peasant Crusade doesn't go well. You can read up on it a little bit, but it's not good. And there'll even be a children's crusade, which is going to be even worse, where a bunch of children are going to be just totally crushed by by the Muslims and even other crusaders who are going to just use them for their money and whatnot. So it's pretty bad. But anyhow, so there is definitely a fever of crusading that goes on, and it has some pretty bad effects on the peasants of Europe and even the children of Europe at the time. And here on the left, you're going to see a picture of Alexius the First, and on the right, you see a picture of the Pope saying "God wills it," and it's actually inaccurate. It actually would have taken place outside of the Council of Clermont and Pope Urban II. So it's an inaccurate photograph, but it's a representation of the Council of Clermont. And here you just see some really important areas that you'll talk about just so you get an idea. Again, Clermont's up here in France. You got Rome, okay, where the Pope is. You got Constantinople, and you got Jerusalem. So pretty much all in this area is going to be where people are going to come from the west to the east and try to take back all of this land. So you're going to have basically four major crusades. There's many other ones, but we're only going to focus on the four major ones. The first crusade is going to be the only successful crusade. It's going to last from about it should be 1095 to 1099. Those are backwards. Over those years, the Crusaders are going to slowly fight and take back the Holy Land. And in 1099, they'll actually lay siege to Jerusalem, and the Muslims will give up the city of Jerusalem. And in true Christian fashion, the Christian knights, after years of fighting and dying in the deserts of the Middle East, are going to be so mad that they're literally going to kill every inhabitant of the city, Jew or Muslim. The streets are going to run red with blood. You're going to have places where little babies are going to be thrown off the towers of Jerusalem because they're Christian, not because they're Muslim or they're Jewish. And this is obviously what Jesus would have wanted. I'm being sarcastic. It was not what Jesus would have wanted. But suffice to say, by 1099, Crusader armies have taken over most of the Holy Land back from the Muslims. This will not last, though. By 1147, we're going to have a second crusade because the city of Edessa in the north is actually going to fall back to the Muslims. And so the church is going to send a group of knights again to take back the city of Edessa. This crusade is going to be a failure, and it leads to an increased actual Islamic expansion into Christian territory taken to the first crusade. So instead of stopping the Muslims, it's actually going to encourage more Muslims to come back and take back the lands they lost in that crusade. The third crusade is going to be after Jerusalem actually falls to the great Islamic commander Saladin. To note, Saladin doesn't actually kill any Christians. He allows them to leave the city, which is different than killing every inhabitant like the Christians did. This is known as a King's Crusade, though, because by this point in our history of Europe, we have kings again that you're going to hear, that you've learned about in section 1 of chapter 8. And this is where King Richard I of England, King Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, are going to try to take back those Holy Lands, and they are not going to be able to. And finally, the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204. At this point, a bunch of merchants from Venice are going to want to take the Holy Land back just because they want to keep the trade routes open. They're going to hire an army of crusaders, but they're going to pay them. And so when they actually get to Constantinople, they're going to pretty much say, I really don't want to keep going into the Holy Land and die. So this place has a lot of money. Let's just attack. So we're going to see what happens is that basically the Fourth Crusade is an abject failure because the knights literally are mercenaries and they just attack the Christian city of Constantinople and pretty much hasten the fact that in another 200 years, Constantinople is going to fall to the Muslims. So no thanks on that. So really the only successful crusade is going to be the first one. All right, so I'm going to leave this one here, and then I'll start a new one, a new flip that's going to talk about the effects of the Crusades.